This is section 3.4, comparing measures of center. So now that we've discussed both the mean and median, how do we decide which to use when we are summarizing our data? Our goal should be to choose a value that's good representative of the typical values of the distribution. And as we've seen, the mean and standard deviation are better for symmetric distributions, whereas the median and IQR are better for skewed distributions. So if we have access to the data, the first step will always be to look at a graph. Computer software will give you the mean and median regardless of the shape of distribution and won't tell you which one you should use. So it's your responsibility to look at the graph to make a good decision about what is the right way to summarize your data. So which of the following distributions are symmetric and unimodal and which are skewed? So these are distributions that you can see in your textbook. So the one on the left here, if you kind of outline the shape, we're looking at a distribution that is skewed right. And we should use the median and the IQR to summarize this data. The distribution here on the right-hand side, on the other hand, is definitely more symmetric. And we would use the mean and standard deviation to describe this data. If we don't have access to the data or are unable to produce a graph, then we should try to determine a reasonable shape for the distribution based on our knowledge of the subject. So this takes some practice, and let's go through and think about the following examples. Salaries of all employees at a large company. So generally what happens for salaries is that we have a lot of people who make down here at the lower end of the salary scale. And then we have a few people, up here in management, and then maybe our CEO or however the company is determined way out here. And so generally what we expect to see is a skewed distribution when we are looking at salaries. The age of death of random sample in Massachusetts. So if we think about what we would expect to see for the age of death, we'd probably expect to see most people dying, in their later years, with a few people, accidents and such down here. And so this one also skewed, only this one skewed left, where the salaries were skewed right. And the IQ scores of a random sample of people in Massachusetts. And in general, this would be a data set that we'd expect to see that would be pretty symmetric, I would say. So this would be the kind that would look like this. And we'd expect symmetric with a unimodal, meaning only one mode. If the distribution is symmetric but contains outliers, so even though we have a symmetric distribution, we're seeing outliers, then we still would rather use the median because it's probably a more accurate picture of typical data. But what do we do if there's more than one mode? So let's look at an example that has more than one mode. We need to investigate whether or not the bimodal aspect of the distribution is due to the data set combining two different groups, okay, and that could make it for two modes, such as heights of men and women. And in this case, it's more useful to separate the groups and use the shape of each distribution to determine the appropriate measure. So for example, the following histogram displays the finishing times for two different marathons. One marathon consisted of a small number of elite runners, the 2012 Olympic Games. The other marathon included a large number of amateur runners, the Portland, Oregon Marathon. What do you think a typical time was for each event? So if you look at the outline of this distribution, we kind of see that we have two modes, or we could say it's bimodal. And it looks like the typical time might have been 150 minutes for this group, where the typical time over here was more closer to 250. Okay, so this might be a case where separating them to look at them would be a good idea. Which measure of center and spread should be used when comparing two or more distributions? If one distribution is skewed, then the median and IQR is more appropriate and should be used for both distributions. So now we have the histogram separated. We can take a look at it. On the left, we have our amateur marathon, and on the right, we have the Olympic marathon runners. So the amateur marathon definitely is looking skewed to me. And we would use our median and IQR. Once we have decided to use a median and IQR for one of the data sets, we should just use it for both. But looking at the Olympic marathon, it also appears to be somewhat skewed. Not sure that was a great outline of that. But we have this tail here you can see. So we can use the median and IQR. That way, when we are comparing the two, we're comparing the same summary statistics. That's all for section 3.4. Next, we will be looking at displaying these statistics.